History podcast, as the name says, using history to understand where we are now and where things are going. And Rabbi Ken Spiro and I have been doing that podcast for almost 3 years now, really since the beginning of COVID, and we have 3 seasons. So this was how we sort of ended up here with all of you, which we're super excited to jump into things today. So maybe what we'll do, Ken, is we'll jump in with a bit of an overview. I think what everybody is looking for right now, especially from people who are in Israel on the ground, even though you're in South Africa right now, you just left Israel. So can you give us a bit of an overview in terms of what's happening on the ground in Israel at this moment? And what are we maybe hearing or not hearing in terms of the mood of the country, and what are the next steps?
Sure. So as everyone now is very aware of, we're going on 3 weeks, unbelievably. This Shabbat will be 3 weeks since on Simchat Torah, when I was in my minyan praying, the air raid sirens went off. And this is not the first time. You know, we Israelis I've been living in Israel for over 40 years. I'm originally from the States, but we're used to it. So I was thinking, well, what happened? And because it was Shabbat Simchat Torah, it was, we couldn't turn on our radios, but we all have access to people who are hearing things, and some of them are medics and work for Hatzalah, or my sister who lives right near where I was praying has a Filipino woman who works for them, and she was on her phone watching the news, and we figured out pretty quickly that something very different than what we're used to is happening. And as we all know how it turned out to be the worst. I mean, ironically, it was literally 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which was a huge surprise attack, which was a shocking experience for the Israeli population in 1973, especially coming only a few years after that tremendous victory of the Six-Day War. It was like getting punched in your stomach and having all the air knocked out of you. So it was absolutely horrifyingly shocking what happened. And the whole country went into a state of mourning. Literally the next few days, the stores were closed. There was no one on the streets. And there was also tremendous. And then as more details came out, and it took a long time for the details to come out, how many people were killed and how they were killed and the number of people kidnapped, the level of anger exploded, and Israel mobilized. And, in Israel, we have, mandatory military service and also a huge number of reserves. And Israel mobilized 360,000 soldiers, and thousands of Israelis, including my own son-in-law, who was in Toronto at the time, where Ellie is sitting now, with my daughter. They were there visiting. He immediately got on a plane. He's a colonel in the Givati Brigade, and flew back. And one of my sons, 4 of my 5 kids have served in the army, and 3 of them were combat medics. One of my sons got immediately mobilized, and he fought in the last Gaza war in 2014 for 38 days. And now he finds himself back there again. So people are very angry. They want justice done. And everyone recognizes, unlike previous, where we would launch some missiles and blow things up for a week or 2, and then there'd be a ceasefire and we go back to an uneasy calm. Now everyone recognizes that there is no way Hamas can be allowed to remain in Gaza. So the country's mobilized. The country was also very divided before this in a lot of ways. I'm sure a lot of people listening were aware of what was going on with the judicial reform in the Israeli Supreme Court, and especially the left, the political left in Israel, which is large, it was out of power, was mobilizing these massive protests. And it was the most divided I'd ever seen the country personally. And on a personal level for me, because I'm a historian and a rabbi, and I like to wear both hats, I was saying to myself, and even publicly on many interviews I was giving and classes I was giving, that, if we're fighting like this, something bad is going to happen from the outside. And I had no idea how bad it would be, but it turned out to be worse than I could have ever imagined. But what we do see, for those of us who know Israel well and have lived there especially, when we're being attacked, suddenly everyone forgets about those relatively petty, insignificant, small things that we're fighting on. And the spirit of unity, it's an amazing transformation. It's sort of like the silver lining. Yeah. The cloud of that event is you can see the best side of the Jewish people in Israel. And of course, everyone in the diaspora immediately started, not just me, everyone I know, started messaging. I got so many messages on WhatsApp and so many emails. I literally just had a cut and paste response for everyone because I couldn't respond to all of them. How are you doing? Are your kids in the army? So I wrote, yes, I have one son and one son-in-law, and they're waiting to go in. So the energy is already. I just left. I came over just yesterday to South Africa, and things are definitely returning to normal somewhat. There's more people on the streets. There was no restaurants or bars or anything open for probably a week to 10 days. Now there's a little bit, but it's very muted. And the other big thing is that's the home front on the front lines. Remember, the front lines in Israel are not thousands of miles away. This isn't like the US fighting in Vietnam. The front line is, talking about 30 miles away, 40 miles away.
Yeah.
So we're waiting. We thought we'd be going right away. And my son, I just literally a few minutes ago, he just texted me, my son who was mobilized, who's a combat medic. He says, we're training, but they're getting very antsy. Like the morale is extremely high on the home front and on the front lines.
Yeah.
And the soldiers have been training a lot because you have a lot of these reservists. This is going to be very difficult fighting. It's urban warfare, which is the hardest warfare. And because we're Jews and we don't believe in carpet bombing cities and leveling every building, it's going to have to be done house to house, which is very risky for our troops. So they're training, they're getting ready, they're still psyched, but everyone's getting a little impatient and wondering. The number one question everyone's asking me is, why are you guys waiting? Why are you guys waiting? Now, of course, I'm not a friend of Bibi Netanyahu's, and he's not letting me know, but I think it's a combination of factors. But the energy it's very interesting. It's stressful, but there's a lot of good feeling about the unity in the country and the productivity. Everyone's getting involved in the religious and the secular and the left and the right, but there's also a lot of, anger and also a lot of fear about the consequences and what other price we're going to have to pay in terms of our soldiers going into and what's happening in the world, because a lot of my friends in the diaspora are very nervous. In many ways, they're more nervous than I am in Israel. They're really feeling threatened.
Yeah, I think there's just there's a collective holding of breath. I think I definitely see that both within the country, militarily and security wise, but also outside of the country in terms of the diaspora. Everyone's just at this point holding their breath, like what's going to happen next. And I think it was so important what you said about the divisions within Israel themselves before this happened, but also the division between Israel and the diaspora has been growing wider and wider and wider over the years. And again, this has been a situation where suddenly that gap between the diaspora Jewish experience and the Israeli Jewish experience has of different consequences, meaning people suddenly realizing, oh, I do care about Israel and I do care about being Jewish. And some people just completely polarizing on the other side and aligning themselves with a totally different rhetoric that's against Israel. So it reminds me of Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, of blessed memory, gave a talk at the 92nd Street Y in New York City once. And he talked about, he was like, what are we? What are the Jewish people? And he said, one of the ways we understand it is as a family. We're a family. And how do we know that? Because we kick each other under the table and pull each other's ears. But when something bad happens, we have each other's backs. But I think what you've talked about before, which I think is so important, is do we really want to wait for things to go bad before we have each other's backs?
Right. So this is clearly a very big wake-up call. A very big wake-up call, because things can be worse. But clearly the big guy upstairs, God, decided this is enough. And we all know, as a historian, if you don't heed the symbols and the signs of what's going on is coming over the horizon, it can only go worse. So the reality is, as bad as this was on a geopolitical level, it's forcing us to deal with something which we've been putting off for way too long, which is the radicalization of much of the Islamic world and the direct threats Israel's now threatened from Lebanon, from Syria, from the Gaza Strip. But also it's on a level of the family behavior. It was getting really bad. Again, I'd never seen so much. I mean, thank God we Jews were not big into rioting and trashing, like you saw in America after George Floyd, a level of violence just randomly directed at everyone. That's not the Jewish way of doing things. but the level of discourse or lack thereof was really getting out of control. So, it's one of those, the way I've been saying,
Yeah.
Ellie, is it's kind of like we got a bucket of ice water thrown in our faces. And what you pointed out was very interesting, that it unifies, why is the Jewish world, not just in Israel, but the Jewish world, first of all, because a lot of people, they may not be on a day-to-day level really that concerned with Israel and visit it that often, but they have warm, fuzzy feelings for Israel, especially the older generation. It's a problem with university campuses and the younger generation falling victim to, the woke intersectionality. But it's also precisely because there's a direct link between what happens here in Israel. I'm pointing to here. I'm not here. I'm in Johannesburg. What happens in Israel and what happens in the diaspora, because it's linked to anti-Semitism.
Right.
It's a big wake-up call that the people in diaspora are recognizing, hey, this is more than just something having to do with the Israel-Palestinian or Arab-Israeli conflict. There's bigger wheels turning up there in very big ways in history of the Jewish people and really what's going on in the world. This is a big inflection point, in my opinion, for where the world is going on many different levels.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find really interesting about this also is, say, in the mother-daughter program that I teach for the bat mitzvah year, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about tzedakah, for instance, when we talk about charity, is it's wonderful to support all kinds of different charities. But let's be very clear. A lot of Jewish people support non-Jewish charities, but there's no non-Jewish people that are supporting Jewish charities. So if we want Jewish infrastructure to continue to exist, we, the Jewish people, are the only one state of Israel, right? Like there isn't anyone else that's going to be helping us out. So I think it's a really, in the West, I know this for sure in North America, that's not always on people's minds. They don't always understand that we're the only ones that are really supporting ourselves and building our infrastructure, because we've grown up with so much incredible infrastructure, thankfully. I want to just turn us to a little bit of our podcast generally focuses on the spiritual and the historical sort of aspects of what we're dealing with as Jews in the world today. This week's Parsha is Lech Lecha. And we get the first command to the first Jew. And the first command from God to the first Jew, Abraham, is twofold. It's Lech Lecha, right, to the land that I will show you. And it seems to me that this is a perfect parsha for us to be able to have this conversation, because Lech Lecha, we understand one of the ways we translate that is go to yourself. And then he gets the command and go to the land that I will show you. So we see this dual mission of the internality of the Jewish experience, but also the externality, the physical manifestation of that experience of a connection with God is the land. So how do we start to understand that in terms of what's happening today? And why is that important that we have both an internal connection with Hashem, but also an external connection with Hashem, which is manifested by the land of Israel itself? How do we frame that for ourselves today?
So I think one of the really good ways, I'm also a tour guide, and the first question I ask groups when I'm guiding in Jerusalem is, you already talked about it. What is being Jewish? Are we a religion, a race, a family, a culture, an ethnicity, a people, and people always say we're all of the above. I say we're all of the above except a race. We're not a race. But we're not just a religion, like being a Catholic, or we're not just a nation, like being an American, a Mexican, or Canadian. We're an ethno or a spiritual nation. And the essential function of the Jewish people basically is, I always like to define us as we're like the God squad. The Jewish understanding of the purpose of creation, the infinite creator of the universe creates a world so he can give. And I think the greatest thing he can give is relationship with us. That's the highest level pleasure there is. That's a fundamental concept in Judaism. But Judaism also understands, we just read this in the last couple of Torah portions. We just read Noach, which was humanity blowing it and losing the connection with God, losing the purpose of creation. And Abraham, who you just talked about, the uniqueness of Abraham, unlike Noah, Noah was righteous enough to save himself and make a boat, but he wasn't really proactive enough to pull other people onto it. The uniqueness of Abraham is he has the
Right.
dedication to the mission, and he's a proactive person in what the mission is, which is to personally have the relationship with God, which is that internalness, lech lecha, but more importantly, to recognize that his goal is to build a nation, which is the sort of the link up nation that connects. We as a nation, our national historic mission is to connect humanity by God, by creating on every level, a personal level, family level, community level, and ultimately a national level, the nation that's the light to nations, that creates the working model for humanity to follow our lead. So, and a nation has to have a piece of real estate. God doesn't randomly pick the land. He doesn't say just put into your GPS whatever locations have cheap airfares or whatever. Go to, Expedia and find some place to fly to for vacation. He sends Abraham. He sends us to a specific piece of real estate. We understand that the way I use this, and it's funny, I just came to South Africa and I noticed about South Africa, they have the weirdest wall plug on the planet Earth. It's the biggest, weirdest plug that no adapter that you can buy in a store, universal, works for South Africa. So, and if you don't have the right plug and your appliance doesn't work, we're a very unique appliance, the Jewish people, individually and collectively. And the only outlet that we can plug into that enables us to reach our peak performance and do what we're supposed to do and create that nation that's a light to nations is the land of Israel. So Israel is not just a geographic destination for it. It's a destiny on a much higher spiritual level. So it's an intrinsic part of Jewish identity is to be Israel. The problem is for the last 2,000 years, the vast majority of Jews for many generations maintain their Jewish identity outside the land, which in and of itself is a fantastic discussion of how does a nation even survive without its national homeland and preserve its identity and outlive not only other great nations, but many of those nations that tried to destroy us. That's a whole other topic we're not going to get into now. But you can't overestimate how important the land of Israel is to our ability individually to connect and elevate ourselves and collectively make that nation. And a huge percentage of the commandments in the Torah are linked, can only be done in the land of Israel. Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish scholar, he says it's better to live in a city full of idolaters in the land of Israel than in a totally Jewish neighborhood in the diaspora. And we only keep the commandments. He really is making, for some, actually spent very little of his life in Israel and spent a good chunk of his life living in Egypt on our border in the south.
Right.
He said, we basically only keeping the commandments outside the land of Israel as practice so we can keep them in the land of Israel. So there's no way of overstating how central
I think it's such an interesting point. And right. I think it's such an interesting point in terms of, I remember a session once at one of the B'nai Kiva camps I was at where the head of the kollel there challenged all of the staff to make a great argument for making Aliyah. And I think one of the arguments that people will sometimes in the religious community say religious and to keep that outside of the land. And so why would we move to the land? And I think it's really interesting what you're saying, which is actually it's better to be in Israel, even if it's harder to keep that, than to be, totally committed and observant, but still outside of the land. That I think is a very, number one, a challenging thing for people to hear, because in the diaspora, we have it good. So how do we reconcile that? And what does that mean? Are we all supposed to be like moving immediately? Like what does that look like?
Well, I mean, we have to also appreciate we're lucky. We're in that generation or two of Jews who have come to a Jewish state, which in, the ashes of the Holocaust a few years later, with no infrastructure, not only was able to grow and absorb literally millions of immigrants, but to prosper in the worst neighborhood on the planet Earth. And now I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching this and listening have been to Israel. And it really is the miracle on the Mediterranean, surrounded by a lot of really dysfunctional places. So it's not anywhere near the level of stress and difficulty to live in Israel today. But that's not to say there aren't legitimate questions. Primarily, the biggest one is, making a living. That's always a big concern. And even Jewish law makes exemptions for people to live outside the land of Israel for certain reasons. You can go to find your spouse, there's economic, there's definitely things you can do, but the problem is we have to, I think, be really careful. We have to, first of all, get it into our brains how central it is. So that even if a person isn't living there, they should always want to be there. The problem is you grow up living, believe me, people who lived in much worse situations as Jews in diaspora would have dreamed about going to Israel, even when it wasn't so nice, just to be in a place where they could escape the persecution and be in our own homeland. But we're like a lot of people. If you grew up, my whole life, I was not raised observant nor Zionistic. I never in a million years thought I would ever be living in Israel. We say man proposes and God laughs. So I ended up here and never planned to be here or a rabbi or anything. But you get used to the situation you're in, and the diaspora galut is very comfortable today. But if we recognize, Ellie, that we are in a story, God is the ultimate producer director. There's a plot to the story. Abraham chose for us. That's what we're reading right now. You said it perfectly. It's not an accident that Lech Lecha is happening now. Just as God is telling Abraham this is fundamental, he's challenging us this Shabbat coming up to focus on the centrality of Israel to Jewish destiny and our mission in the world. We have to really wake up to the understanding that living in diaspora, and this is a harsh thing, and I say this, I go around the world speaking, I say diaspora is a punishment. Today, today the jail cell is very nice, so to speak. It's very comfortable in many ways. In many neighborhoods, it's more comfortable, the nicest places in Israel. But we're only outside the land of Israel because we misbehaved and we got exiled. So we have to also recognize, and this is why it's so important, that there is no long-term future outside diaspora. Now, when I say long-term, long-term in Jewish history is hundreds of years. But if you look at the history of the Jewish people, and we've been through so many thousands of years of our history, we have been bounced from place to place. If you look at how you got to Mexico or Toronto or New York or Paris, it's been a very long journey, but it's only because we were thrown out of somewhere that initially invited us in or welcomed us in even. And then because we got too comfortable, it's kind of supernatural, but even the most places we get most comfortable in are often the places where the greatest anti-Semitism suddenly appears to shake us up. And if we're lucky, it happens slowly. And that, by the way, is directly related to what's going on now. Just as there's a direct link between what's going on in Israel and anti-Semitic incidents around the world, it is really shaking up a lot of people I know, many of whom are not Zionist or religious. Do I have a future in America? That the land of opportunity and freedom is suddenly becoming very scary to people. So everyone needs to have on their radar, even if it's far away in the outer side of the radar, that Israel is the place that we're supposed to be. And we should do whatever we can to make that possible. I've been saying literally for decades, redemption is on the way. So get real estate now, because once Mashiach comes, the property values are going to go way, way up. I jokingly say the French Jews, and France is a place with a very large Jewish population, the biggest in Europe, but also a massive Muslim population and a lot of anti-Semitism. So they are literally, compared to Jews in America, they're several decades ahead in being uncomfortable. Yeah. And therefore, they're the ones who are buying so much real estate. You go to Netanya in the summer, and you think you're in Marseille across the Mediterranean, because literally everyone is speaking French. And many of those people are not even living there. They just come for the summer vacation, but they already got one foot in the door. And that's, I think, the correct attitude. Even if a person isn't, able to come immediately because their kids are in school and it would be too much of a difficult position, or they can't afford it. That's the view we have to have.
I think it's such an interesting view too. And I think we've spoken about this several times on the podcast, that you can't, though, just be driven by fear to connect with, to end up where we're supposed to be. And I think it's so interesting to think about this idea that, I've heard you speak before about this idea that often Jews in the diaspora are like the messenger that are forgotten the message. But I think we're also an indigenous people to a land that we've forgotten that we're indigenous to. We've been out of it so long that not only has the whole world forgotten that this is our land, but we've also forgotten that. And this idea of zachor, like remembering who we are. So remembering who we are both internally as Jews and externally as we are a people that have a connection to a land, I think this is part of the shocking wake up that the world is getting. And the world is pushing back, saying, no, you don't have a connection to that land. We don't remember you ever being there. And we're saying, wait a minute, like our entire orientation in terms of our practice and our identity, lech lecha, to the land that I will show you, says, no, wait, this is intrinsically bound up with who we are in the world, on an internal level in our practice and our connection with Hashem, but on an external level on our relationships with other Jews and with the land itself. And I think that's just a really wild idea that we ourselves have forgotten that Israel is our home.
100%, absolutely. And that is really what you see going on both within Israel now. The fact that there's probably something like 1 million Israelis living in the diaspora. Israelis who are not necessarily, most of the people who end up going back are people who are not necessarily Jewishly tied to Israel as they are. They look at their identity as Israeli and maybe completely, irreligious in their observance. So these are people who are more likely probably to leave because they don't have that spiritual connection and realize the centrality of the land of Israel to their spiritual growth and the national historic mission of the Jewish people. But even those people were definitely much more connected to Israel because they have family in Israel and they grew up there and they even speak Hebrew as their first language. When it hits the fan, they all come back. I heard a statistic, I got to check, that 200,000 Israelis came back to Israel in the last couple of weeks, and that the call up, Tzav Shmona, this emergency call up, which is what my son and son-in-law got, and another son-in-law also got it, but my daughter just had a baby like 10 days ago, so they let him off because this was her first kid, and he didn't want to leave her alone having a baby in the midst of all of this. But when you get called up for emergency call up, not everyone's going to show up. I heard it was 140%. Meaning they got 40% more than they even asked for. People were just coming and volunteering. I want to come back to Munich. I want to fight. So for Israelis, it's a big wake up call. But like you said, 100% that it's definitely for Jews living in a diaspora. Like, what does this mean to me? Even if, like you mentioned, the Jewish people are a messenger who've forgotten the message, which is a quote from the great Jewish thinker Abraham Joshua Heschel. Because our role in history, regardless of where we are as a people, is so central to the whole, our job is the ultimate job of being the role model, connecting humanity to God, teaching the world values. I mean, God knows the world needs values. If we don't do it, no one is going to do it. And this is a topic I've spoken on and written books on, even, of the impact of monotheism on morality is the most transformative idea in human history. The basic moral furniture, to quote the historian Paul Johnson, of the human mind, value of life, peace, proactive social responsibility, equality before the law, social justice. This all comes from us. And in a world, because it's not just what's going on, with Israel and the Middle East, the whole world is really a very messed up state. People can't even tell what's up and down and right and wrong, and basic, even biological truths are being questioned. It's not that we are being affected by the world. It's the world is out of kilter because we don't have our act together. And as a nation and a people, we've lost sight.
Say more about that. What does it look like?
What does what look like?
When we have our act together? Just what does it look like historically and ideally when the Jewish people have our act together? If we don't know what that is, we can't model ourselves after it. So what does that look like?
Well, first of all, it means that we are committed Jews. You always say committed is a dangerous word because we tend to look at each other and what we wear and what we have on our head, and that's how we judge each other. And that's not necessarily an accurate barometer of that. But we always say, this is a great line that we use in Esha Torah all the time. You can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents. So it's first the people who's educated. We're the people of the book. And knowledge is power, and the knowledge that comes from the creator of the universe is the ultimate wisdom for living and power as in terms of the power of ideas. So it's being educated Jews, and it's having a clear vision of what we're about, which, by the way, is not just because people are observant doesn't necessarily mean they're very clear on what being Jewish is about. A lot of Jews thinking that keeping the commandments, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat is the end of what Judaism is about, but really it's a means to an ends. The ends is that's a system given, which is divided into two kinds of commandments that are between us and our fellow Jews and our fellow human beings, and commandments between us and the big guy upstairs. And we have to have that, but we have to have both of them in a balanced way. And if you look, I have a whole presentation just on this topic, but much of the religious world is very obsessed on this relationship. You know, how kosher can I keep and how strictly can I keep Shabbat, but often maybe not looking at their fellow Jewish brothers and sisters who may not look and live exactly where they live as their people they have responsibility towards, much less so the rest of the world. And then there's a bunch of Jews. I just saw someone sent me a video of a guy screaming down in New York, obviously very left-wing, screaming, is a Jewish guy screaming that, you know, this is not in our name, you're slaughtering, you're committing, he's telling Israel's committing genocide in Gaza, not in our name.
Right.
The extreme of the other side of the Jewish world is obsessed with social justice, which is an intrinsic part of Judaism, but without the balance, you get Jews for every ism and Jews for even isms that are anti-Judaism and anti-Israel. So you have a whole huge crowd of Jews like yelling at Israel when millions of people around the world are doing that also. So what it should look like is Jews who are balanced Jews, Jews who are educated Jews, Jews who are proud Jews, and Jews who have clarity to understand that what our mission is in this world, and we're supposed to be creating a Jewish state, which is not just like any other state, which was often the vision of early secular Zionist leadership, just to be like everyone else. It's never been our mission to be like everyone else. And the world is never going to let us be like everyone else, whether we are religious Jews or secular Jews, whether we live in Israel or diaspora. What is going on now in the world is that bucket of ice water telling us that Israel's held to a ridiculous double standard. Jews around the world are being targeted for what Israel is doing because even on a subconscious level, the non-Jewish world recognizes, no, you guys, something you need to be doing that we're lacking in this world. And so when we are unified and we have a state that is a nation that's a light to nations, and proactively, not through conversion and conquering. That's not the Jewish mission in the world. We never do that. We make it very hard to convert to Judaism. And I always jokingly say the only Jewish empire in history has been Hollywood. And that hasn't been a source of Jewish values. But one thing I know, right. I'm not a businessman, but I know that if you do something right, people will copy you. The Chinese are experts on that one. I always tell people, there's a famous quote in English, a famous idiom that says, imitation is the highest form of flattery. When you copy someone, even if you're stealing their ideas, it's because you're giving, it's a compliment. You're doing something right that I want to do also. So imitation is the highest form of flattery. I always say that is the shortest class that you ever got on Christianity, Islam, and liberal democracy. If it wasn't for us living in our homeland or even living in diaspora, even when we're persecuted, still doing it better than other people did it, creating community and values, and proactive social responsibility, just doing things that the rest of the world simply was not doing, they would never have followed us. And that is what it's supposed to look like. And ideally, the only way that can really happen ultimately at 100% is us being in our homeland, but creating a nation that is not just like everyone else. Like it says in Hatikva, Liotam Choshi B'Artzenu, to be a free people in our land, but Liotam Kadosh, to be a unique spiritual people that is unified, proactive, and using the wisdom we get from the creator of the universe to create a unique country that the rest of the world is going to want to come and learn from. That's what it looks like. And by the way, just want to throw in one more piece. The closest we ever got to that was King Solomon. When we had 40 years of peace and prosperity, we had like a model kingdom, and it says they came from all over the world to learn from King Solomon. When you do it right, people come to you. And that's the messianic vision that the nations of the world will even grab Jews who are disconnected and they'll start schlepping them back on the El Al flights and say, come to Israel with us. We hear God is with you. And that's what we're supposed to do. And if we do it right, they will stop fighting against us, but they will back us and want to learn from us and even support us.
Beautiful. I think one of the challenges then, would you say historically, is we don't have, 40 years out of 3,000 isn't a big chunk of time to model ourselves after that. So in some ways, we're reinventing the wheel. We're saying we've never been in a situation where we've both had our land and half of our people are living outside of it, where we can live so comfortably and safely as Jews outside of Israel, which was unheard of even 100 years ago. And at the same time, we have a military state of Israel where potentially there's even more protection and more safety. It's a very unusual time, I think, in our own Jewish history. So what are some of the things that we should be focusing on from here? I know we're going to take questions in about 5 minutes or so, but what are some of the things that you think, what does history inform us of in terms of where we should go from here, both with this war in Israel?
Yeah, so that is really the $1,000,000 question. And I always say, because again, like I say, I wear the rabbi and the historian hat, that we have to be like a good doctors in this case. There's the external symptoms, like a person who has a disease inside their body that's actually very serious, but it's manifesting itself with some sort of sores or blisters on their skin. So we have to appreciate that we have to be very careful not to get confused. As scary as the anti-Semitism and the external threats are, this is a fundamental point of Jewish worldview to recognize that from Abraham onward, which is what Lech Lecha is about, we have a contractual agreement with the creator of the universe, which is, he says to us, we say this in the second paragraph of the Shema every day, in the morning and at night, you keep your side of the bargain, I will keep mine. Our side of the bargain is to have a good relationship with God, like I said, and with each other. And he says, you will prosper in your land and the nations won't bother you. When bad stuff happens to us, because all of human history is this great interplay between human free will, and God gives us the free will to do incredibly stupid things if we want to, and God's infinite power and control. So depending on the decisions we make individually and collectively, that's how external circumstances will affect us, which means, bottom line, external threats to the Jewish people, be they the Babylonians 2,500 years ago, or the Romans, or Cossacks in the Ukraine, or Adolf Hitler, or Hamas and Hezbollah, on some level, those people are definitely responsible for the evil they're perpetrating against us and anyone else in the world. But on some level, and you cannot think otherwise, because God is infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing. There's nothing happening in the universe that is outside his knowledge or control. On some level, it has to do with decisions we are making. And that's really important, even though it sounds kind of vague, because that means on a practical level, yes, just as you have the sores on your skin that are annoying you and you're scratching and you can't sleep, you got to put the cream on there. You got to see the dermatologist. So we have to recognize that that's what Hamas is. That's the pussy sores on the skin there. We got to deal with them militarily. They have to be eliminated. If you're not fighting in the front lines of the Israeli army and you're in Israel, everyone's running out and volunteering. People are doing everything from helping people to harvest crops down by State Road because there's no foreign workers, and they evacuated the population. And millions of dollars of crops are rotting in the field. People are, sending food and it's amazing the amount of chesed and trying to find places for the families that are being dislocated because they're in war zones to come live in. But people in diaspora, in your Mexico, wherever you are, there's things you can do. Everyone, as human beings, our job is to look at the unique gifts that God gave each and every one of us and see how we can maximize them and use them to the greatest extent possible to improve the world. And each and every one of us needs to do now, what can I do with my connections, with my ability to speak, my ability to write, my ability to give money that can make a difference in this world? Because that's what we're going to be judged on. I always say God is like the ultimate coach for a sports team. A good coach doesn't say, I want 100% results. The good coach says, I want 100% effort. So if each of us have that, that's a huge difference already, number one. But the other thing is, of course, to recognize that if that's only the external problem, we have to deal with the internal symptoms. We really, really, really now need to make an effort, whether we're in Israel or diaspora, to focus on what is going on here. Clearly, we are, as a people, and it's not religious versus secular, we are failing collectively as a people to move the world in the right direction. And clearly, if you look at the situation in the world, like I said, it's very out of kilter, and you can't say anything's right or wrong or good and evil anymore, that the world is really losing its compass, and we are humanity's compass. So we have to get, first and foremost, clarity. My Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, the founder of Eshet Torah, he was obsessed with this idea. He used to say clarity or death. As Jews, whether we are Jews who are just at the bottom of the ladder and don't know much about our Judaism, or Jews who are very well educated, sometimes they have great learning skills and can learn Talmud, but a lot of even those Jews, I don't know how clear they are on really what we're supposed to be doing in this world. We are the role models for humanity, and we have to function. We have to recognize that when I say we, it's all of us. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew on a physical level and on a spiritual level. But even if we're not holding in the same level, the first step we have to make now is to agree to disagree, recognize we're all part of the same family. And I always tell people, you don't, like any parent knows, you don't always like your kids, but you always love them. You don't have to agree with every Jew you meet, but you're my brother, you're my sister. I can respectfully disagree with you, but we're in the same boat together. And if we forget that, the non-Jews are going to remind us. Religious is secular, living in Israel, not. They come after all of us. So this is really the alarm has gone off for us to wake up and really refocus on who we are and figure out how each and every one of us individually can come together and maximize our potential and focus the incredible energy. We are like 0.2% of the world's population, but the Jewish people are the most transformative force in human history. And imagine a unified Jewish people living in the land of Israel, that appliance that's the Jewish people plugged into that outlet that is Israel, and connected and focused on our mission, because we love all Jews. We love changing the world. Even Jews totally disconnected are always trying to fix everything. Imagine if we could get in the same piece of real estate and on the same wavelength and in our own unique different ways, and really start focusing that incredible drive and creativity that has been so transformative. We're going to push humanity over the top and get it to where it has to go. And if we don't do that, not to end on a scary note, we're going to be put in more difficult and dangerous situations until we're all like looking up at heaven and saying, God, please help me. Because, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, great Jewish rabbi from the early 19th century, he had the best line. He said, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. And he doesn't mean literally Kiddush with a cup of wine on Friday night and Havdalah on Saturday night with a cup of wine. He means when we don't fill the world with the values that have transformed the world and continue to be like a fountain pouring those values into the world by living them, then the world will be full of the opposite values. The opposite values are evil. And when evil comes into the world, it will target us first. So the ultimate wake-up call of all of this is Kiddush Hashem. It's to live and act in a way that inspires people individually wherever we are in the world, and to create a nation that is a unique nation that's connected to God and a source of values. And like I said, when we do that, like Isaiah says, the nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. They'll stop making war, but they'll all say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways. And out of Zion will come forth Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And that is the vision that we're all aiming for. A holy people connected spiritually in the Holy Land, being a model for the world to follow. And that's when we get an end, not just anti-Semitism and threats to Israel, but peace for us and really for the whole world. And we should see that soon in our days.
Amen. 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 Okay. Beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi Spiro. We're going to turn to a couple of questions that are KEN SPIRO. You can use the Q&A in the Zoom. You can find that on your toolbar. And Dalit is kindly translating the Spanish to the English for us. So Ken, there's a couple of questions.
Yeah, looking at them here,
the first one is, so the world shows us that the world is full of enemies. Wouldn't it be better to just make peace? And how and where did the Palestinian flag become the flag of the left worldwide? So I think they're really wondering, like, what do we do with this situation? Are we actually really going to be able to make it better? And how is the idea that the Palestinian flag somehow represents liberal values?
Okay, that's a great question. But to start with the first part, just to make peace. Peace is great when you can agree on things, but when you have an intractable enemy, that is the Hamas charter, in its charter, calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jews. So you don't make peace with people like that. Peace is something, again, to quote Rabbi Weinberg, he used to say, all men of good intention will reason together and come to a common conclusion. If the goal is to peacefully coexist with your neighbors, then there's definitely ways of doing it. If your enemy's goal is to kill you, you can't make peace with such a person. So there's unfortunately, there's evil that has to be stood up to and evil that has to be eradicated. But the other question is a really good one, because the reason why we're seeing all this explosion on university campuses, especially of these rallies that are overwhelmingly anti-Israel, even though Israel, even though it went through this horrible, 1,400 people murdered in the most brutal ways and kidnappings, is because of what's gone on in the world. And this is, again, going back to the lack of us fulfilling our mission, the lack of clarity in the world as to what is right and wrong and good and evil means that values have just metastasized, which is a term we used to talk about cancer, into things that kind of sound nice, but are actually completely often evil. What's appeared in the world, and it's been building literally for decades, is what's called this woke intersectionality. This idea, this new way of looking at the world, that anyone who is successful or victorious or strong is somehow evil or wrong. There must be some colonialist, usually obviously white colonialist enterprise that is gotten to where it's gotten because it is a dominant oppressive force that has sucked the lifeblood out of various indigenous peoples. So, and the number one factor that's used to decide this is skin color, which is a ridiculous way of deciding anything in this world. Martin Luther King would be
right.
over his,
And I think it speaks to the larger experience of anti-Semitism in general, which is in each generation, whatever the devil is of that generation, that becomes what people think the Jews are. So now the devil of this generation is if you're a bigot and a racist and a colonial, and you're a colonizer and there's apartheid. All of these are the big bad things of the world right now. So of course, suddenly Israel, the only democratic state in the entire Middle East, becomes the absolute symbol for colonization, apartheid, racism, bigotry, and oppressing indigenous peoples, which are all of the devils of this particular age. So it's a fascinating thing. If we look at all the devils, the last generation where it was communism, or the generation before that where it's, that each time that's anti-Semitism shows up in the form of whatever the shadow devil is of that particular generation. And all these words are being used to apply to Israel and, to be honest, at this point, to Jews in general.
Exactly. It's what you said perfectly. The Jews are not all white, by the way. I have a son-in-law who's Yemenite, and he's so dark. His nickname was Shoko, which means chocolate milk, So we come in all size, shapes, and colors. But exactly, it's based on a complete distortion of history and fact, which is very important that people know basic information about the history of Israel, our connection to the land of Israel, the history of the Arab-Israeli peace process or lack thereof, the fact that Israel is not occupying Gaza, that we threw Jews out of Gaza and gave it to them in 2005. Then Hamas took it over, threw the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza, literally killing a lot of them, and then immediately started taking all the foreign aid and making tunnels and missiles and started shooting missiles at us. And there's so much disinformation that people need to be clear on. But the problem is with this intersectionality, like Black Lives Matter and Palestinian, activism have to be together, because these are people of color fighting against white colonialism. And it's based on the other lie, of course, that, Israelis, we're not the indigenous population. The Palestinians are the indigenous population, which is complete distortion of history. Joshua brought Jews into the land of Israel 1,900 years before any Arab showed up in the Middle East in the 7th century of the Common Era. So it's like a lie built on a distortion. But again, in a world where there's no such thing as facts anymore. That's just your facts versus my facts, combined with this intersectional narrative that all people of color are oppressed and living in an intrinsically oppressive system, which by nature of skin color, if there's no way of solving it, it just has to be dismantled. And that Israel is viewed as the last vestigial remnant of colonial European powers that, out of guilt for the Holocaust, which they go as far as to say was either didn't happen or was that Jews exaggerate, that the land was stolen from the indigenous Palestinians and given to a people who are not even a people, they're just a religion, and they're from Poland. So there's so much going on in there that we need to educate ourselves and be clear on. But unfortunately, it's almost de rigueur, as we say in French. If you're a progressive liberal, and that's what university campuses are, you have to buy into a checklist of things that you are against or things that you are for. And unfortunately, Israel, which was 50 years ago, viewed as the little David fighting against the Arab Goliaths around him now, is we are the mighty Goliath oppressing the small indigenous population that we're keeping in ghettos and perpetrating genocide against them.
Right. So I want to take a couple of more questions before we finish up. And we're going to try to get to everyone's questions as best we can, or I'm going to try to sort of compile them into a one question. So I think a lot of people are asking who should rule over Gaza if Hamas is actually, they're able to eliminate Hamas as the rulers of Gaza. Who should rule over Gaza? I think there's a lot of back and forth about what this could look like, what it should look like. And then I think let's end with the question in this, because people are saying, is there going to be a massive aliyah after this war? What is this going to look like? So I think in the current crisis, is it a good time to make an investment in Eretz Israel? So can we start with who should rule over Gaza after they wipe out Hamas?
That's a great
Historically,
question.
what does that look like? What are some of the possibilities? And then should we all go?
I see it. Simon Masri said that. Yeah, it's a great question. I actually wanted to address that, so I'm very glad that he asked it. This is going to be the real test of the international community. Literally, since the founding of the State of Israel, the Arab world does not care one bit about the Palestinian population. The Israel absorbed about 750,000 Jewish refugees who were ethnically cleansed from surrounding Arab states between 48 and 67. Meanwhile, at least 500,000 Arab refugees from the land of Israel, who, by the way, were not calling themselves Palestinians at the time. That term wasn't adopted till the mid-1960s. Fled for various reasons, not to go into that, to the surrounding Arab states, and have been kept in a state of limbo in places like Lebanon, Syria. They still don't have Jordan. They don't have citizenship. They're limited. There's restrictions against them. So they don't really care about these people. Israel has offered Jordan some sort of autonomy and some sort of leadership role over the West Bank area, Judea and Samaria, and even offered Egypt. You want to come back and take over Gaza again and run that place? Even though you lost it in 67, 6-Day War. They're like, no way, we don't have anything to do with this stuff. So what has to happen is, this is the test of the international community. You want to bash Israel. The Palestinians are the largest recipients of per capita of foreign aid on the planet Earth. But look what they do with that money. It's corruption and making weapons. Will the world be able to form some sort of coalition? Ideally, it would be a local Arab population, surrounding Arab countries getting involved in boots on the ground on some level. It shouldn't be Westerners, and it certainly should not be Israel. Israel does not want to be in Gaza at all. With European support to create sort of a Marshall Plan like we saw after World War II in Europe and Germany, to enable a grassroots indigenous to Gaza Palestinian leadership that are not raised from literally preschool to hate Jews and want to commit suicide and murder people at the same time. So if the world can step up and really help them clean up the mess and make sure the aid is used correctly, and there's a lot of, Gaza could be paradise. It's an amazing location. They're living next to Israel. The work opportunities, one of the people killed was an Israeli activist who was just in the process. He spent his whole life helping Palestinians in Gaza, was in the process of creating a giant industrial park to create thousands of jobs for Palestinians. It could be a fantastic place. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way, but let's see now what if the world actually steps up and wants to be part of the solution and not just hit on Israel or support us when we're militarily being threatened.
Amazing.
God
willing, I think there's so much possibility there. And then I think the second question is okay, are we going to see people saying like, oh, Israel, that's too unstable, I don't want to go there? Are we going to see a mass aliyah? Do you consider it a good idea to make an investment at this point in Israel? And what would that look like?
Yeah, so again, it depends. Israel's always on. Ultimately, with the big sweep of history, is always a good investment. But in terms of the practical here and now, I think it's really going to depend on two factors. How much trauma Israel has to go through now. Hopefully it won't be massive damage to Israel's infrastructure with a regional war, obviously, but assuming that's not the case, it's going to depend really on two factors. What Israel does when things quiet down. Do we not go down to where we prefer? Like, not saying we're going to stay up to the same level of unity and idealism, and it would be great if we did, but can we at least recognize we can't go back, so that a lot of the internal tension, which is, pushing people even out of the country, some people, especially on the left, I can't be here anymore. But a lot depends on what's going to happen in diaspora, because I think the level of, unease amongst a lot of Jews living, I'm not talking about Zionist religious Jews, recognizing that, whoa, scratch the surface of my liberal democratic country, and underneath there's a lot of hatred and animus and threats. And we'll have to see also, just like what happens in the war in Israel, how bad is it going to get in diaspora? Because obviously, if there's a big upsurge in, really threatening anti-Semitism to Jews, That's going to be a big wake-up call. But again, the point is not to do it like, I'm grabbing my suitcase and trying to get an emergency evacuation flight. The big picture, going back to where we started, is to recognize that Israel is a miracle, despite all the tough things we've gone through. Everything about the creation and perpetuation of the Jewish people and the rebirth of the Jewish state is absolutely supernatural and amazing. And whatever challenges we face, it's still an incredible place to live in. And the values of the society, even when we're fighting amongst each other, the leveling of caring and unity. Israelis, by the way, are rated as I know it's hard to believe, some of the happiest people on the planet Earth. When they do these international surveys about how happy you are, Israel comes up, except for a couple of countries in Scandinavia that there's nothing going on up there. As one of it's hard to imagine, but there's something unique and special about the land of Israel. And always, this is clearly, that's one of the really deep messages, is God wants his children to come home. And now is a great time to do it, and not to do it, God forbid, when we're, like during COVID, people were really scared. Israel closed down for 1.5 years. People couldn't get in. That was a big message also back then. Get in, get a piece of real estate, make aliyah. You can always get here in that case. We'll send the Air Force to rescue if we have to. So absolutely. And it's always, by the way, to add to that thing, the real estate in Israel is, it's expensive, but it's always a great investment. Some parts of the world, real estate isn't so great. I'm in South Africa now, and people have these amazing houses that are, because of the political and economic situation here, they're beautiful, but they're kind of worthless. Everyone I know who's bought in Israel has made a great investment. So obviously that's only going to be greater demand as more and more Jews come back. So absolutely. Like I said, the French are getting all the good apartments.
Amazing. And I think what I understand also is, that there is a plan there. If we need to get out, Israel will make it possible for every person to find a way to be there. But of course, you want to be more at the front of the line than you do at the end of the line. So it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of, the timeline of history that we're on right now. I remember that very same rabbi saying, do you want to be part of history happening, or do you want to watch it from the sidelines? And being in Israel, you're part of history happening right now in this moment, watching from the outside. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking about what is your life about.
Exactly. And just to add one more practical thought, because I know my own kids have the same issue. Where they live and where they want to buy don't necessarily work, because sometimes where people want to live is too expensive to buy. But two of my kids they just bought apartments in different places in the country as an investment, which they're renting out, and they're living in Jerusalem, or one's in Modin and one is living in Jerusalem. But I tell people, get something anywhere. You don't want to be like the Moroccan Jews in 1952 living in a tent on the Egyptian border with a spigot of water, when you're moving from Toronto or some nice neighborhood in, New York. So yeah, absolutely. Always a good time.
Good point.
We're lucky enough to be the generation that can actually say that we can do this. How many generations of Jews said at the end of Passover, next year in Jerusalem, but it was only a dream, and they never lived to visit, much less own or have the opportunity to live in a state run by Jews after 2,000 years of exile.
Beautiful. All right. So I think this wraps up our talk. It really dovetails nicely with how we began, the idea of Lech Lecha, right? That we're in a time now of starting to continue the mission that was given to Abraham, right? Go to yourself and then go to the land that I will show you. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Dalit, I don't know if you want to say something to end things off, but Rabbi Ken Spiro, thank you so much for, as always. If anybody wants to find us on either Apple or Spotify podcasts, you can find us at Remember What's Next. That's the name of our podcast. We have 3 seasons there. And of course, if you want to find more information about what Rabbi Ken Spiro does on his website, kenspiro.org, or is it .com? I know, I can't remember, .com. And if you want to get in touch with me, you'll find my information also in the liner notes of the podcast. Dalit, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I think Dalit is not on.
It's entirely possible. Oh, there she is.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Gracias a todos. Y va a quedar esto grabado, están los subtítulos activados y muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Thank you, Rabken. Thank you, Ellie. It was really, really nice hearing you guys.
Thank you. Thanks for making it happen.
Such a pleasure.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
for having us.